So we'll talk more about your Substack, The Old Continent, but let's get right into the piece. I thought it was a really provocative title. Is Trump laying the groundwork for socialism?
Yeah, so I also chose the title to be sort of a little bit provocative because I'm really interested in like American politics, and I wanted to kind of write about how Trump's rise to back to the presidency would affect kind of the American left, and
Hmm.
why I think Trump's ascent again has helped kind of the left flank of the Democratic Party rather than the liberal side. And I used the kind of title a little bit provocatively. I obviously don't mean Trump is consciously laying the ground for socialism in the sense that he is purposefully doing it, but I do think that in an indirect way he is doing so because I think the way in which he is delegitimizing some parts of liberalism, I think, is quite fruitful for socialists and leftists.
Yeah, super interesting. And I agree. I want to unpack that more. So let's start at the top. You talk about quote unquote elite theory. So what is elite theory?
So lead theory is it's a group of theories, and I think the most famous person today who is kind of a little bit of a provocateur is Curtis Yarvin. Other people have also had this theory, and basically what people say is the the majority of the population doesn't matter that much because the only people who can influence politics are just elites. Because you need to be organized, you need to have resources, you need to have the time to get into politics, and the only way to do that is if you're already rather wealthy and if you have a certain ability to influence politics. And so they say that certain strata of the population influence politics disproportionately to their how what percentage of the population they actually make up. And for the American right, this meant that they want to form what they call a counter elite. So their idea is that the American left basically controls the institutions, and the institutions are very leftist. They're biased in liberal direction. And so for the conservatives to be successful, they need to form counter elite, which replaces the old liberal elite. And that's sort of had an influence on some people in the Trump administration and their approach to his second term.
And you think this is a useful and operative, if simplistic, way to understand power, politics, and culture?
I think it is. I think it's simplistic, and I think I said that in the piece. I don't think it gets the entirety of politics, and I think it misses out a lot of things because I do think that the mass does matter. I don't think you can say that politics is just elites, but I do think that oftentimes it is quite easy for elites to disproportionately affect politics. And so I think there are a number of situations where certain very small groups of people can affect the politics very disproportionately. And even if you look at like some leftist parties, if you look at the Bolsheviks, they had a very small elite circle, like the people around Lenin. And even if you had the masses be ready for revolution or whatever, you couldn't have done it if you hadn't had this very tightly knit, well organized circle. And I do think that without having a kind of elite, so to speak, it's very difficult to quickly change politics in a broad way.
And to what extent do you think these folks on the right have succeeded in their goal to replace or alter the elite?
Not very much. I don't think they're doing it right. I think that if you apply the theory that they themselves have set up, they're kind of failing because they're not selecting people for efficiency. So if you look at the people who form the elite of the right, they're not selected for doing anything. They're selected for being sycophantic to Trump. So yes, you have a counter elite, but the counter elite isn't selected for doing anything. Its primary purpose is to validate Trump and his ego. And so I think they're good at that. They're good at making Trump feel like he's the center of the universe. But in terms of actually implementing policy, I think they're quite useless.
So we'll get back to elite theory and how maybe it still applies, even if they've done a poor job of implementing it. Because as I understand it, elite theory has been functional in a bipartisan way. That there have been
Yes.
sort of elites on the Democratic side and elites on the Republican side, and that successes for either partisan coalition have been connected to the influence of elites in previous eras. But you're sort of looking at the Trump era and seeing a broad movement among elites into the Republican camp.
Yes, and I think the new thing with the Trump administration is that they consciously attack the institutions which are associated with liberals. And I think that's something which previous Republican administrations haven't done to the same degree. So previous Republican administrations, if you look at the Bush administration, they were very efficient in terms of implementing their policies, but they did not consciously attack the sectors of society which they viewed as liberal. So there wasn't the same degree of attacks on universities that there is right now. So I think what has changed is that they've become much more determined to actually replace liberal institutions. They've become much more determined to actually go to the sources of liberal power and say, we're throwing you out and we're trying to replace you. And I think that's something which is new to this administration, or at least new in the degree to which it's happening.
And what has been the effect of that?
So I think the effect here is that they're primarily making people very angry. And one thing which has often been stated by people who are critical of liberals is that they're hysterical about Trump and that their distaste for Trump is disproportionate to how dangerous he actually is. And I think one of the reasons for this is just because Trump and his ilk are attacking the sources of their power to a much greater degree than previous Republican administrations did. I think that what I assume and what I argue in the piece might be the long-term effect is that it will actually change liberalism and change leftism, because if you take people who are part of the elite, if you take people who are liberals and who have always had a certain access to power, even when they're out of power, and I think that's very much true for liberals, so they are quite influential in academia and media, and so they kind of have power to a certain degree permanently, even if it's not the organized kind of political power. And I think if you attack that for long enough, at some point, people might become more radical. And I think that's what I based the premise of the piece on, that having your source of socioeconomic power attacked makes you more radical, and it makes you more open to possibly back more radical solutions.
So you talk about the wine moms.
Yes.
And the I've Had It podcast is sort of a paragon of that change.
Yes. And so, yes, I've used this. It's obviously not scientific because it's just anecdotal, but I think it is interesting anecdotally because it's not a demographic group you associate with any form of political radicalism. Traditionally in America, you think that suburban moms are like the bastion of sort of either conservatism or normie liberalism. Like if you remember Bernie Sanders when he was trying to run, a lot of people who support Bernie Sanders had this like resentful attitude towards the wine moms. And especially when he ran against Hillary, it was often mentioned how we have these like suburban voters and they're screwing everything up. And I think what you see is that suddenly these people are much more open to somebody like Mamdani, or also to just sort of ways of talking which are more radical, or which appear more radical. And I think that's something new. And I think what this also has to do with is that if you really implement the policies which Trump wants to implement, they would drastically reduce the socioeconomic status of educated people. And that's the base of the Democratic Party. If you look at the base of the Democratic Party, it's educated people and also older African American voters. And so if you attack the source of socioeconomic wealth and influence of your opponent, you make them angry. And you might create incentives for them to become more radical and to also lessen what they've done previously, which is that the people who were the greatest supporters of the Democrats have effectively gatekept the party against the left. So they've made sure that certain types of leftist politics can't enter the mainstream, or if they do enter the mainstream, they do so in very small quantities where you can easily control them and marginalize them effectively. And I think that gatekeeping function might go down.
I agree. But I wanna unpack that a little bit more. Why you think that tendency to gatekeep the left has been effective at the base level, and why this new opening up, this new radicalization, this feeling that Democratic base voters have economic precarity at the hands of the political opposition that maybe they hadn't felt previously, how that lowers the effect of this gatekeeping, or it enables the more radical members of the coalition to have a lot more purchase among the mainstream. What's the cause and effect here?
So I think to the first point, why it's been effective in the past, I think it's because you've had a number of factors. One, I think you just have what kind of is described in elite theory, that people who are of a higher socioeconomic status can disproportionately affect the political system. And in the case of the educated, they
Mm,
can affect it more because they have more time to organize. If you're a relatively educated person with a stable career, you've just much more time you can put into politics because you don't have to worry about surviving. And so your organizational capabilities are much greater. I think whoops, it's also been effective because the Democrats could point to certain obvious successes of the past, and they could always say, okay, you may not like what we're doing right now, and you may not think that we're advancing, but we have the successes. We have the Civil Rights Act, we have women's rights, we have Roe v. Wade, all of these things. So you could just pitch it to people like, okay, yes, we're not maybe doing the economic policies you want, but we have these things and we need to safeguard them. And in addition to that, Democrats oftentimes had this narrative that things will automatically move in a more liberal direction. I mean, it's often been mocked when Obama said the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. So I think they could sell it to their base that, okay, you may not like what we're doing, but if we just make sure that we keep these things safe, these values which you guys like, then automatically we will move in the right direction and society will become more liberal, more egalitarian over time.
sure, sure.
And as to why I think it's worked against the left specifically, I think it has to do with the Democrats. Certain groups of people have left the party, especially white working class voters, and so it becomes easier and easier to maintain cohesion with the people who are left because you drive certain people out. And what's I think also interesting is there's a book which is called The True Believer.
Mm,
And what the author mentioned is that the people who are oftentimes drawn to political radicalism are not the people at the very bottom. Actually, the people who radically change societies are people who are downwardly mobile. So it's not people who've always been at the bottom. It's
right,
people who
right.
started up higher and then go down. And why he mentioned this because he says that people who are just at the bottom and have always been at the bottom, it's quite easy to give them small concessions and they will be fine. So if you've always been poor and you've always struggled to survive, and somebody says, okay, I'm not going to implement your policy vision, but I'm going to slightly give you more money here, a lot of
Right.
people would just take that. But oftentimes, the people who actually make sure that radical movements succeed are people who have been middle class or maybe upper middle class and who've seen their fortunes decline. And those are the people who will become truly radical and who will become what he calls the true believer. And those people are necessary to make political movements work. And I think you're beginning to see that more and more on the Democratic side.
So John Gans talks about this idea of the rabble, that the people who are downwardly mobile in any socioeconomic class, whether they're in the 0.001% or the 1% or middle class or working class, that what Trump has been able to do and what other historically fascist regimes have been able to do is find the people who feel aggrieved
Yeah.
because they're not able to make what they thought that they could or what they once actually were able to, and bring them all together in one shared energy and one shared effort. Uh, and what I hear you saying is that experience of dislocation and disillusionment and activation can funnel in either direction towards a
Yes.
an authoritarian right, uh, and we'll say that maybe speaks in the language of populism, but doesn't address with real populist solutions, economic solutions, or the populist left that speaks to the language of populism, speaks to the language of anger and dislocation, but then it addresses that with real populist solutions that actually improve people's station.
Yes, and the other thing which I think is the case with Trump, where I think people are somewhat lucky, is that Trump himself is not a very he's not a conviction politician. He's very opportunistic, and his opportunism severely limits the degree to which his agenda is actually being implemented. So I think that this is in some ways an advantage which the left has, which is that they have this person which they hate correctly because of myriad things which have been elaborated on previously. But I do think that there is something. It could have been worse because I think that Trump, his laziness, his megalomania, all of that, it overwhelms any sense of concerted political project. And so I do think that that is an advantage which people on the left have because Trump is oftentimes just content with having people validate him, and he doesn't care that much about the agenda of MAGA actually being implemented consistently.
Right. Right. Yeah,
And
it's sorry, go on.
yeah, and I think that I do think that the potential is there for people on the left if they play their cards right to also use some of the ways in which I think Trump has kind of destroyed the existing system to build something better. I think you would have to seize power, so to speak, at the right time. I
Mhm.
think there's a window of opportunity which is somewhat narrow. I think probably the next one or two presidential elections, but I think it's there in a way in which it hasn't previously, I think.
I agree, and I hope that you're right about, cards on the table. Is that what you would want to see? I mean, do you believe that the more leftist project is a better, charts a better vision for the United States?
Yes, absolutely. I think that I think every political project ever has some flaws, and I think the modern American left has flaws, but I think it's vastly superior to what exists because I also just think the left has the advantage. It hasn't been tried before. The last time you could actually talk about leftism in the United States, I think, is Carter or maybe the late Johnson administration, but since
Yeah.
then it just hasn't been tried. And so I think every system at some point it just gets super stale, and the people who are within the system already can't do anything new because everything they have to offer has already been tried. I think the left just has the advantage. Their solutions genuinely haven't been tried, and also they've just consistently criticized certain types of things which are gigantic issues: the level of economic inequality, the degree to which money influences politics. And I think all of those things are very much something which primarily I think the left has something to offer. I think that the populist right, it doesn't really want to talk about these things. It oftentimes wants to talk about these things by proxy. And I think the way in which it talks about it by proxy makes it inefficient and unlikely to actually solve the problems of the country. And I do think leftism is just the best way forward for the United States, at least in the medium term.
Well, when you talk about Mayor-elect Mamdani, people who are more ideologically aligned with us have zeroed in on how important it is for him to not notch some successes and things that haven't necessarily been tried, even relatively modest things that haven't been tried, and waving the banner of democratic socialism that if you try some of these things and they fail for whatever reason, then that's going to be a test case used to argue against the broader viability for democratic socialism and even incrementally democratic socialist advances. So it's a high stakes proposition there, which
Yes.
he's spoken about as well. I'm curious about the unraveling, about everything being, a completely new political terrain. Last week when I spoke, or earlier this week, excuse me, when I spoke with John Newman about the Middle American radical and the opportunities there
Yeah.
for kind of within horseshoe theory. We talked a bit about things dissolving into air, and how what was left is now right and what was right is now left, and how things are very, very fluid within our political landscape. So I'm curious how much you think things have kind of gone up for grabs by Trump, and how much you think within the Democratic tent, the broader pro democracy tent, you think this new opportunity for socialism to strike is also rooted in a reaction to Biden and the failures of the Biden presidency and the Obama presidency before him. Because you talk about this play where, a little bit of leftism is welcomed in and kind of co
Yeah.
opted, and you get, a bone or two thrown here or there. But at the end, the status quo is more or less maintained. And that was almost exactly what I think Biden did. How much of this new opportunity you think is directly a response to Trump versus directly a response to the Democratic Party's response to Trump?
I think it's more the latter, because I think if the Democrats had, assuming that instead of Biden, you had elected a president who was semi-competent, the opportunity wouldn't exist. So if somebody had been able to beat Trump in 2020 and then either defeat Trump themselves in 2024 or do like a switch where the vice president runs and then the vice president defeats Trump, I think that would have closed the door for leftism. But
And so, wait, I want to, but you're saying it doesn't even have to do with how the administration governs,
oh no,
so long as, I mean, yes, that, but also if the political victory is there, then the political opportunity for socialism, right? If Biden had done exactly what he had done and somehow won re-election, either for him or for a successor, but his platform had been the same, right?
no, I don't think the opportunity would have been there. I think if they had won, even if they had done all the things which they did, which were horrid, if they had won, they would have gotten away with it, I think. But I think the opportunity is only there because they lost. I think if they had won, then people would continue to support the Democratic elite, or at least the people who I'm talking about in the piece would, I think.
Yeah. So you're talking to me from Hamburg, Germany,
Yes.
where it is Black Friday. It's the day after Thanksgiving. These might not mean anything to you. They're big things here in the United States. So you seem like you have a real grasp on this, and I'm really curious about your personal interest in American politics, and you write regularly on this stuff. So how did you get interested in this stuff, and what is your stake as a German in what happened here with our internal domestic political outcomes?
So I think that the United States is so powerful and it has so much power over Europe that you really can't understand European politics without understanding American politics. Because the way that politics here works is that you get something in the United States and then a couple of years later it gets over the Atlantic and it's implemented in Europe. And I think you will also see that with like MAGA populism. You're already seeing it. You already have something like Viktor Orban. I'm almost certain that you will have MAGA-like figures govern most major Western European countries in the years to come. So how I got into politics, I just always loved to read, and I've always been very interested in American culture and also in history. I love reading about history and I love reading about politics. And I always I think that when you only talk about politics in Germany and you only listen to domestic German media, you get an extremely narrow view, because Germany as a country, it's not a very politically creative country. And you will have these very consensus oriented parties. And so the politics is incredibly narrow, and it's not the same as in the United States because it's not as corrupt, but it's narrow in its own way. So I think if you really want to understand European politics, which is the thing which I'm actually most interested in, my uh, my Substack is about European politics first and foremost. But you have to also talk about American politics. You can't understand European politics without American politics. And I think that that is somewhat lessening, but it's still very much present. And I think that at the very least, the Trump MAGA movement will cross the Atlantic. And I think it's interesting to see if you get some sort of leftist movement which develops in the United States post-Trump, whether that will cross the Atlantic too. I personally would probably think so. I used to think that kind of the MAGA, AfD, Le Pen wave would be kind of the last time that you would get this
Mm.
broad cross-Atlantic political movement. But I personally do think you will probably, if you get something like Mamdani, obviously you can't run for president, but if you get something like that as president of the United States, you will see copycat movements in Europe as well. And so
Hmm.
because of that, I just think the two are intrinsically linked.
Yeah, I think so too. I appreciate that, and it's not a one-way street either, right? It's a feedback loop. It's a rich, fluid, complex ecosystem of power and influence, and it's a lot of the same political consultants and organizations that
Yeah.
work with left-wing candidates or right-wing candidates here in the U.S. work with parties in the EU. You published a piece today. You publish quite frequently. For folks that are watching this, if you don't already subscribe to the Old Continent,
Yeah, please do.
please do. And I thank you for coming to have this conversation with me. I wanna circle back to the way that you end the piece because I think that it's really interesting. And if I'm reading it right, you talk about the new, the newly reshuffled, constantly reshuffling class coalitions, and
Yeah.
how that potentially engenders a sort of new elite, a new left, not center left, but left
Yeah.
elite, or what we would consider, close enough to proximate elite for the purposes of elite theory, that includes, the so-called PMC, professional managerial class, that in the prior structure had kind of been either co-opted into the establishment status quo or didn't really pay it much of attention or care because their bottom line didn't seem to be affected either way. And what seems to be emerging, again, it's anecdotal. We're not looking at a whole lot of data, but what may be emerging is a sort of new coalition of elite leftists that would be both much more sympathetic to a more radical, more truly socialist or democratic socialist platform, and able to organize their real power to achieve those changes in the way that, uh, you know, in opposition to a right wing elite that is, you know, that advances further economic dislocation and further erosion of pluralist democracy.
Yeah. I think that what you mentioned with the class coalitions mattering, I think that's incredibly true. And I think that part of the reason why American politics seemed so stuck for so long is because you had a kind of gentleman's agreement between the super rich and the educated. And I think you got this from the Clinton era onwards, which is you had the kind of Reagan revolution. And then afterwards, you got the Clintonite revolution. And basically, what the Clinton people did was they basically took the educated and they basically said, okay, so we're not going to attack the super rich. And in return for that, we make sure that the kind of socioeconomic privileges of the educated are somewhat protected. And you had an economy which was very much geared towards education, towards managerialism, towards people who live in cities, all of those things. And what I think has happened is actually that Trump has broken this because what Trump has done is he's basically said, no, the super rich don't need the educated. And so he's basically said, okay, we can just have the super rich. And instead of the super rich needing to do anything with the educated, the super rich can just go to the people, to the working class and talk to them. And what I think was the idea behind MAGA was you can forge a coalition between the super rich and the poor, the working classes, and you can do so by attacking the educated. And so the super rich and the poor have a common enemy. They can attack the socioeconomic privileges of the educated. And what I think that will do is that it will change the way in which the educated view politics, because they've been in a coalition for the past 30 years, but that coalition has collapsed. That alliance has collapsed. And so they need to come up with something new. And you could theoretically just say you have basically a political movement which is only for the educated, but that's difficult from a majoritarian perspective. And so I think that at some point, just out of desperation, you will have to form a coalition with certain parts of the working class. And so I do think that in some ways, Trump, he is very much spurring on the development of a more healthy left liberal coalition, because it was very stale, it was very dysfunctional prior
Yeah.
to him. He's not doing it intentionally, and there are a lot of negative consequences to his rule. But I do think that in some way he is kind of helping the left to a certain degree, I think.
Well, it's this parallel where Trump exposed the Republican Party and the conservative movement as being empty and weak,
Yeah.
and the ability with which he first infiltrated and then dominated, and then after January 6th becoming sidelined and then coming back to reassert his whole, it really has shown how whatever existed before was a real piece of crap. And to his credit, he's been able to revitalize that. I think that's a lot of what not just electeds and elite Republicans have been drawn to him, because he's brought them out of the wilderness. But I think a lot of regular voters or non-voters have been attracted to Trump by his ability to, essentially take, a dead shopping center, right, or a dilapidated three by four block uh, uh, residential zone and revitalize it. He's sort of done that to the Republican Party, but at the same time, there's this parallel where he's also exposed the Democratic Party as being equally vacant and equally weak and equally incapable of responding. A Democratic Party that was healthy would have won, would have not just won, but reoriented its platform and its position to respond to the political incentives that Trump is laying out. And yet they haven't. And I think it's really actually impressive at how little the Democratic establishment has adapted. And you see people refusing to endorse Mamdani or endorsing him in this sort of kind of lackluster way. People still trying to pretend that Graham Plattner is not that he's bad, but that he's a loser when he's showing a great deal of momentum. So it's extraordinary to me how much it seems like out of touch these folks are.
Yeah.
And what I find most intriguing about your analysis is that it feels like this would have happened eventually, but what Trump did is he came in and catalyzed an organic. It's like this is what happens when systems reach their ultimate conclusion, which is such grotesque economic inequality. But that instead of happening over the course of 5 or 10 election cycles, that Trump has sort of condensed that and catalyzed it down to a period of 2 or 3 election cycles.
Yeah, I think in some ways Trump is kind of similar, and it's an odd comparison, but people have made it previously to Napoleon, in that I think he's kind of Napoleon if Napoleon was an idiot. And because if you look at Napoleon as a person, he didn't really build anything. He just destroyed what was there previously, because the fact that Napoleon got as far as he did, even though he was eventually defeated, it showed people how decrepit everything was. And even though he was defeated by people who very much wanted to uphold the previous system, they knew that they couldn't, because they'd been exposed. Because the fact that Napoleon had been able to essentially defeat the entirety of Europe for a number of years, it showed to everyone just it's so decrepit, it doesn't work. And I think there's very much this thing where once you point at the emperor and somebody says the emperor has no clothes, then suddenly people wake up. There just needs to be something which exposes the dysfunction of the system. Because even if you kind of know it, like the people know that the emperor is naked, if unless it's been clearly exposed to where you are sure of it, people are still kind of hesitant to act on their conclusions. And I think Trump has just completely exposed it. And the other thing, which I also think is interesting, is that the Democrats have been super corrupt for a long time,
Super
but
correct.
they used to be slightly competent. Like if you looked at people like Bill Clinton or Obama, they knew what they were doing. They were horrible. They were crooks in a way. They were super
Right.
corrupt,
Right.
but they knew what they were doing. And if you compare that to the people now, they don't know. They don't understand anything about
It's so
politics.
true. You're right. You're right. It's as it because if you throw, like you said earlier, if you throw enough crumbs out, if you
Yeah,
continue to demonstrate, enough incremental social growth or change, then you can kind of thread that needle or kind of hold the coalition together. But
yeah,
Chuck Schumer is so incapable, and Tom Friedman is so Ezra Klein. These people have
yeah,
they don't have it. They don't and look, in fairness, maybe the conditions for them now are just so much worse than the conditions that Obama faced when he was, or Jeffrey Goldberg, or the whatever the equivalent is, that when Clinton did it, it was easier to pull off the con, but it's a lot harder today for Biden or Kamala or Speaker Jeffries to pull off the same con.
yeah. And I think what it also is that whenever you have kind of institutional revolutions, you always get the kind of first generation. And the first generation is still somewhat competent because they know what it's like to not have the system. So when Bill Clinton came onto the scene, he still faced the traditional Democratic Party. He still faced the New Deal Democratic Party. And he had to work very, very hard to do what he did. And what he did wasn't, I mean, it kind of worked in the short run. It worked for the 1990s, but in the long run, it had very negative consequences. But even if you didn't like what he did, he had to work hard to achieve it. It was difficult because you had to talk to unions. You had to convince unions to pass NAFTA. You need to be good at what you do to do that.
Right.
Even if you're screwing people over, you need to be smart to screw over people to that degree. But
Right.
nowadays, you don't have any of that. And the people today, all they know is this version of the Democratic Party. They've never seen the New Deal
So true.
Democratic Party.
It's so true. If you grew up in Clinton's Democratic Party, which is might as well be Reagan's Democratic Party,
Yeah. Well,
right?
I think it's I kind of I think it's somewhat different because I think that I think the difference between Reagan and Clinton is that I think Reagan really cared about content. He actually cared about policy. I
Mm.
didn't like what he did, and I think what he did was had very negative consequences. But I think he actually cared about the policy, whereas I think the Clintonites cared more about process. If you think about Clintonism, it's inherently it's not really an ideology, it's more a method. And I think what's
Right.
different is that you have a certain kind of system which maintains itself and the way in which the two parties work. I think what happens is that the Republicans always care about actual policies, or they used to. Nowadays they really care about Trump and his kind of cult, but they used to care about policies. And the Democrats, they don't really care about policies. They really care about methods, and they care about we have a certain kind of socioeconomic group, and this socioeconomic group likes to do things a certain way. And the thing which is the most important to them is that we keep doing things this way. We keep doing things in such a way that validates the skills and the inclinations of the educated in their kind of group. And yeah, I think Clinton, his kind of methodology, it froze the system to an incredible degree, I think.
That's a really, I think that's a really salient observation. I think there are still some Republicans and conservatives who want to do things, and we see those things being
Yeah.
done, or we see Trump triangulate between those things and certain other things that people want done. But I think you're right. I'm curious, looking to the midterms in 2026 and then further on to the general in 2028, or maybe the primaries leading up to 2028. what you're going to be looking for. Let's say the thesis is not just that Trump has laid the groundwork for socialism, but that we are on the cusp of a democratic socialist revolution. Say we're looking at a blue wave where Democrats retake control of not just the House, but the Senate. That we see Democratic socialist endorsed candidates win at the local level all over the country. That we see a massive blue wave win from not a centrist Democrat in 2028, but somebody from the AOC Bernie Mamdani wing of the party, not just endorsed as the nominee, but crush whoever the Republicans. If that's the future that we're heading to, what are the signs that you're gonna be looking for, whether anecdotal or statistical, in the weeks and months to come?
I think so. I think in 2026, I think is a little bit complicated because I'm not sure that a blue wave would necessarily help the Democratic Socialist faction, because I think there is a way in which a blue wave could occur. And if you have a blue wave with current leadership and you get a lot of people who are kind of centrist and you get sort of the David Shore theory, I think you could very easily then use that as justification for why we should maintain the system going into 2028. So I'm not sure that necessarily blue wave has to mean that democratic socialism gets better. I think what matters a lot is the actual candidate selection, and I think what matters is what happens in primaries. So I think you should really look out for how primaries develop, and if you have maybe. So I think the interesting question is: are Democratic voters willing to take more risks? Are they? I mean, they're not actually taking risks, but are they willing to do things where the establishment tells them that they are risks? Are they willing to put up candidates where the establishment says, no, we can't run these people? And are they willing to do that in more purple or red states? I think going into 2028, the big question is just, is there any figure on the left who has the talent of Mamdani or who has a comparable talent? Because I don't quite think there is anyone. I think that if you look at like the most prominent leftist politicians, I think Mamdani is the best. I think then you get Bernie, and then I think AOC is a
Right.
lot below that. I think she's
Right.
not bad, but she's not as
Mhm.
good as Bernie or Mamdani. And I think you need somebody. You need, I think, at least a B plus politician, and maybe an A minus.
Do
I
you
think
think do you think that there's any, because this would actually directly contravene the theory that John and I talked about the other day, which is if you're progressive or you're speaking in progressive terms, but you have an authenticity problem on that, can you still win? And that's to tee up people like Ro Khanna, who sometimes speaks, you know, in very pro tech. I mean, he's Silicon Valley's representative,
yeah.
right? AI and all of these things. And it's like, well, what is the deal with this guy? But in other times, he's a total Bernie-crat. Or Senators Van Hollen and Senator Murphy in particular. I think nobody's actually talking about Van Hollen for president. I think Murphy is somebody who's really put himself out there a lot more. He is younger, and he's from my sense, in yours may be better research than that. My sense is he used to be a pretty normie Democrat,
Yeah,
but over
and
the last year or so, he's come out and made much more kind of left aligned statements. So does that strike you as authentic? Do you think that would strike voters as authentic? What about somebody like him, who I think we would say is probably a B or a B plus political talent,
I I
embracing the Bernie platform?
I think I don't think Murphy's authentic. He kind of strikes me as like a kind of a democratic version of like JD Vance, and that I
Sure.
think he has latched onto a certain kind of intellectual lingo, and he uses this intellectual lingo to depict himself as kind of super new and like he has the deep insight. And I think it's kind of an act. I think
Mm.
it's very kind of try hard, but I think it's still a positive development. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're building a political movement, it doesn't really matter whether the people in the political movements are opportunists or whether they're genuine, as long as they effectively, uh, as long as they perpetuate the goals of the movement. It doesn't matter if you're an opportunist but he's doing his job well, what does it matter at the end of the day? I think Ro Khanna is also somebody who's interesting because I actually think Ro Khanna is kind of illustrative of what we talked about. Because I think in terms of socioeconomic background, he is this very like educated person, very close to Silicon Valley, very immersed in the tech world, and I think he's actually pretty good. I would probably prefer Ro Khanna over somebody like Chris Murphy, and I think I would also prefer Holland over Murphy. I think that of those, Ro Khanna is like, yeah, I think he's like in the B2B plus, and I think the offers are also there. I think Holland at times is really, really good. I think that when he traveled to El Salvador, I think that he quite effectively utilized the media. I think he did a very good job because a lot of other Democrats were completely scared of touching that issue. And I think he did a very, very good job in the way in which he depicted it in the media. So the thing to me is I just sometimes the great man theory is important. Like you can talk about a lot of things. There's sociology, there's elite theory, but sometimes you need the great man or woman of history. And I think this is also kind of a moment. I think if you had somebody who had the political talent of, say, Obama, or maybe even somebody who was slightly worse than Obama, and they were a genuine leftist, I think they would become president. And I think they could genuinely transform the country. You
So
just need that person.
what about somebody in the media? I think, your piece specifically cites Jennifer Welch. I don't think anybody expects her to actually. I think she's in the right place, and I think she understands she's in the right place behind a microphone, not on a ballot. But what about somebody like a Jon Stewart?
So, so I'm slightly hesitant because I think we kind of have an example of what that looks like, and the example is Trump. And I think that what you run the risk there, if you take somebody who is a media figure, I think that they could very much win. I think Jon Stewart could become president. If he ran a good campaign, he would become president. I think the problem is in politics, you need a very specific skill set to actually implement policy. And that's very, very, very difficult. And I think people in media oftentimes don't have that because you need to have an organizational capacity and you need to have a certain ability to, you need to, a certain cruel streak at times. And I think this is true even of people who are great politicians. When you read about FDR, when you read about LBJ, they were unsentimental about what human beings are like. And I think that's difficult for people who are in media to imagine because people in media oftentimes think the way you put something in the media, the way you discuss, the way you talk is everything, but it's not. You also need just a kind of ability to bend people to your will. And that behind the scenes looks different from what it looks like on camera. And you also need that behind the scenes ability. You
Yeah.
can't transform a country like the United States without that. And I think having somebody like Jon Stewart run would be great, and you should try it. But I would prefer somebody who actually is a politician over somebody who's a media figure. Because I think you can just look at Trump, and Trump is just absolutely horrid at actually implementing his agenda,
Yeah.
which
I'm
is
going to
good.
throw, it is good. Right? Part of the reason you see so many executive actions is because that's what leaders who can't pass legislation do, right? Is they just issue these executive orders.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw something out there. I have a bias because I grew up in Minneapolis and he was my representative. But I low key think Keith Ellison uh, could be, because he's a genuine progressive. He's done great work as the attorney general for the state of Minnesota, taking Trump to court and winning. He's been a politician for a long time. He ran for and lost a campaign to head up the DNC as its chair a number of years ago. When you talk about being able to be sort of brutal and exert force of will behind the scenes, he's somebody who I think people would look closely at as maybe a vice presidential candidate. But he's a true progressive. Last thing I want to ask you about before we go: what effect, if any, do you think the endurance of the Epstein files controversy has on the broader dynamics that we're talking about? Is something that has been at play and doesn't seem to be going away. What effect, if any, do you think Epstein has on all of this?
I think it matters because I think that the Epstein thing, I think it has uniquely hurt Trump because the biggest plus that Trump has always had is that people perceive him as an outsider. And the Epstein files are something which uniquely destroy that image of his because the way in which he's done it and the fact that, he was almost certainly blackmailed by Epstein and trapped likely by raping or probably by raping either an underage person or a person who was sex trafficked in some way. It just posits him as an insider. It puts Trump in the same category as people like Clinton, Bill Gates. And so I think it destroys his appeal. I I don't think that it matters that much in terms of whether we get leftism, because I think for that it matters more on the Democratic side. And I do genuinely think that the most important thing in American politics usually is economics. I think American politics is uniquely determined by economics. And I think we also live in an era where a lot of scandals and stuff, it just doesn't matter that much anymore. I do think that the way in which it has occurred has uniquely hurt Trump in a way in which other scandals haven't. But I personally think I think the Democratic side matters more. I think that you need that kind of singular figure who is able to really break through for it to occur on the Democratic side. And I don't think you can get there just by Epstein dragging Trump down.
But don't we benefit from an environment where, you know, we're not likely to hear from morons like Larry Summers quite as much, where maybe we're not quite as likely to hear from morons like Alan Dershowitz quite as much. Maybe, just maybe, we're not going to see a Bill Clinton sent to campaign in Dearborn, Michigan, and talk about Judea and Samaria. No promises, no guarantees. I'm not holding my breath, but is there some downstream effect where people directly or indirectly implicated in Epstein who have been uh, influencing Democratic voters and the Democratic internal process away from leftism, more towards this corrupt centrism, that them being quiet or wanting to be quiet helps to leave a little more space for voices on the left that aren't in any way implicated?
I mean, it might also hurt Chomsky, but uh, yes, I think so. I do think that I could imagine that the Epstein affair kind of is that 200 years from now, we look at it like the kind of American version of where Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." That in future history books, people will look at this as like this kind of unique emblem of the inability of the American people to hold the elite to justice. And
Mm.
I do think that I think it can catalyze people, but I do think you do need just an effective figure on the Democratic side. And I don't think any one scandal or any one problem which Trump has can provide that on its own. I do think you do need a kind of positive figure on the Democratic side. And I don't think Epstein can drag Trump down at that far where that will kind of happen automatically.
Yeah.
And I think also that's just the biggest problem which the Democrats have right now, because the fact that Mamdani is ineligible to run for president, it means there isn't this like one figure who is this singular unique talent who could capture the presidency. And I think that figure would have to appear. But I think if that figure does appear, then it's anyone's guess.
Well, listen, a year and a half ago, nobody even knew who Zoran Mamdani was.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
also correct.
a handful of New Yorkers, but stranger things have happened. Uh, Final thoughts before we sign off?
Final thoughts. Politics is interesting, and we live in quite bad times. But I think one of the things you can take some pleasure in is if you're interested in politics, which I would encourage anyone to be. then we live in interesting times. And I think that you can see society changing. And I think that informing yourself, reading, writing, maybe getting organized, joining a party, all of those things, I think they are quite enriching. And I think that they allow people to take some solace and some positive things out of pretty trying times. And so I would encourage anyone who has an inclination in that direction to do so, whether that's in the United States or in Europe or Asia, anywhere. I think it's important, and I think it allows you to feel a little bit more content with the bad things which are happening in the world.
Good. Amen to that. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Now that Thanksgiving is over, we're moving on to Black Friday and holiday season. We moved right on to Merry Christmas. So, happy holidays. If for anybody who's watching this,
You too. Happy
thank you
holidays.
so much for tuning in, either live
Thank
or
you for having me. It was quite an honor.
Yes. Well, we'll have to do it again. And if you don't subscribe to The Old Continent, please subscribe to The Old Continent. If you haven't subscribed to me yet, you can go ahead and change that. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.